A story about John Tyler almost demands a different kind of doorway. One that opens not with thunderous victories or mythic heroism, but with the quiet, stubborn force of a man who refused to fit the frame history tried to place around him. Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, entered the national stage through an accident of fate, yet turned that accident into one of the most unlikely political odysseys of the 19th century. His journey moves through contradiction, resilience, and the fierce independence of a man shaped by the borderlands of early America. This narrative traces that unusual path, from Tyler's Virginia upbringing, steeped in classical education and states' rights philosophy, to his improbable rise to the presidency after Harrison's sudden death. It follows him as he battles a hostile Congress, faces the collapse of his own party, and navigates the moral and political storms of a young nation straining toward expansion. Through personal triumphs and wrenching conflicts, Tyler's story reveals a leader who defied labels and carved his place in history not by marching alongside the age, but by confronting it. His legacy, for all its fractures, still echoes in the constitutional foundations of the United States. Understanding him is to peer into the unpredictable ways individual character can bend the arc of a nation, subtly, stubbornly, and forever. Chapter 1: A Boy in the Land of Tobacco. The story of John Tyler begins long before he ever stepped into the swirling winds of American politics, before the speeches, before the debates, before the accidental ascent to the presidency. It begins in the quiet, sun-drenched countryside of Virginia, where life moved with a rhythm that seemed almost older than the nation itself. John was born in 1790 on a sprawling tobacco plantation just outside Charles City County. The land there had a temperament of its own. In summer, the fields shimmered like bronze waves beneath the unrelenting heat, and in early mornings, the mist clung low to the ground, softening every edge of the world. The plantation house, built from sturdy timber and brick, stood above the fields like a patient sentinel, watching over generations of Tylers who had lived, argued, dreamed, and died within its walls. Inside that home, young John, lived in two worlds at once. One world belonged to the plantation itself, full of earthy smells, workers' shouts carried across the fields, and the constant labor that made the tobacco economy both prosperous and morally complicated. The other world existed in the study of his father, Judge John Tyler Sr., whose presence filled the room like a quiet storm. The judge was a strict man, but not unkind. His voice had the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to. His shelves overflowed with books, philosophy, law, history, political treatises, classics in Latin and Greek. The scent of aged parchment and ink, mingled with the faint smoke from the fireplace, became the perfume of John's childhood. It was in that study, more than anywhere else, that the boy's mind opened. He learned early to read not just for information, but for meaning, to dig under the words for the currents shaping human society. When his father discussed Locke's theories of governance or the delicate structure of the U.S. Constitution, John listened with a seriousness unusual for a child. He soaked in each argument, each idea, as though they might one day be tools he would need to wield. Yet, John was not a prodigy in the obvious sense. He was slight in build, almost fragile, and somewhat shy around strangers. But behind those quiet eyes was a mind that flickered restlessly. He would sit on the wide wooden porch for hours, a book half open on his lap, watching the horizon shift with the passing of clouds. There was something about those Virginia skies, vast, unhurried, indifferent, that fed his imagination. Under them, he contemplated questions far larger than himself. What direction would this young country take? What role might he, the second son of a plantation family, play in its future? The answer was not yet clear. At that age, he had no grand ambitions of political destiny. His world was still small, defined by the boundaries of the plantation, the expectations of his family, and the early lessons of duty and discipline that governed Southern aristocratic life. But history has a way of choosing its instruments long before the instruments know they've been chosen. John's education advanced quickly, driven by his father's belief that a sharp mind was not optional, but essential. The Tylers were a family steeped in public service. Legislators, judges, soldiers, lawyers. The idea that one should serve Virginia, and through Virginia, the nation, was woven into the fabric of their identity. For John, that meant long hours of study, rigorous debate at the dinner table, and exposure to the political tensions already brewing in the early republic. Even as a boy, he sensed ideological fault lines widening across the states. The Federalists, with their preference for a strong, centralized government, rubbed uncomfortably against the Jeffersonian Republicans who championed states' rights in a more decentralized political order. John found himself drawn instinctively toward the latter. Perhaps it was because he had grown up in a place where local life mattered deeply. Perhaps it was the influence of Virginia's political giants, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, whose ideas dominated conversation throughout the state. Or perhaps it was simply in his nature to resist anything that felt like distant authority. Whatever the reason, these early impressions would shape the rest of his life. While other children his age chased one another across the fields or played games in the dusty roads, John preferred solitude. He read, he wrote, he debated silently with the authors of the books he devoured. Sometimes he wandered through the quiet paths behind the plantation, imagining he was walking through ancient Rome or revolutionary France, testing political philosophies against the backdrop of rustling leaves and chirping cicadas. He was sensitive, too, to the contradictions around him. Though he grew up surrounded by enslaved labor, the backbone of the plantation economy, he rarely spoke of it in later life. It hung in the air like an unspoken tension, shaping him in ways he may not have fully understood. The young republic called itself a beacon of liberty, yet half its economy relied on bondage. That contradiction would haunt America for generations, and it shadowed the world John was born into. His father, recognizing his son's growing intellect, sent him to the college of William and Mary when John was just 12. 12, a time when most children were still learning who they were. John walked through the doors of one of the oldest centers of learning in the country. There, in rooms lit by flickering oil lamps, he encountered a broader world of thought. Professors who encouraged him, classmates who challenged him, libraries that stretched his imagination even further. Those years solidified something in him, a belief, still forming, that the nation was at its strongest when power remained close to the people and the states. A conviction that he could articulate positions others hesitated to voice. A budding suspicion that he might one day be called to defend those positions at the highest levels. By the time he returned home, the boy who had once stared at clouds while pondering the future had transformed into a young man with a clear, though still quietly held, sense of purpose. But destiny has a habit of hiding its sharpest turns. John Tyler's life would not follow the smooth, respectable path expected of a lawyer's son. It would twist, abruptly and often. He would become both a respected statesman and a political outsider. He would stand firm on principle even when it cost him allies. And eventually, he would become the first man in American history to ascend to the presidency not through election, but through death. A transition the Constitution had not yet clearly prepared for. For now, though, none of that had happened. The plantation, the books, the Virginia sky, all of it remained. And as the sun set over the tobacco fields, casting long shadows across the earth, the young John Tyler walked home with steps that would one day echo far beyond that quiet land. Chapter 2: A Young Lawyer Finds His Voice. By the time John Tyler reached his late teens, the outlines of his future had begun to take shape. The boy who once lingered in his father's study, absorbing the philosophies of Locke and Montesquieu, had now stepped into the world with a sharpened intellect and a quiet determination. Returning from the College of William and Mary, he carried with him not only classical knowledge, but a sense that his life's trajectory would be tied, perhaps irrevocably, to the fate of Virginia and the nation still finding its footing. Law, unsurprisingly, became his first path. The study of law in early 19th century Virginia was not simply a profession. It was an initiation into the world of public life, a training ground for future legislatures, and an arena where ideas fought as fiercely as armies. For John, it meant long months apprenticing under his father and other respected lawyers. He spent evenings bent over case documents, sometimes dozing face down on parchments lit by dying candle flames. He memorized statutes, debated precedents, and practiced courtroom rhetoric out loud in the fields when he thought no one was listening. He wanted mastery, not for prestige, but for the power clarity offered. The law, he realized, was the lens through which the country interpreted itself. At 21, he was admitted to the Virginia bar. His first cases were modest: property disputes, small contractual disagreements, quarrels between neighbors whose anger outpaced their reason. He handled each with a mixture of composure and fierce preparation. It didn't take long before older attorneys noticed that the quiet young man possessed a rare skill. He could argue forcefully without raising his voice. Judges listened because his logic unfolded cleanly, as if he were drawing a map through thick forest and pointing out every turn. Yet beneath that measured exterior burned something harder to articulate, a philosophy still congealing, a belief that government should never stand too far above the citizens it claimed to serve. He distrusted centralized authority, just as many Virginians of his generation did. They inherited the spirit of revolutionary suspicion, shaped by stories of British overreach. John wasn't hostile to the idea of a nation bound by common purpose, but he bristled at any sign of federal power overshadowing the states. To him, the Constitution was not a blanket of national supremacy. It was a delicate balance, a pact holding together independent communities. This belief will become the backbone of his political identity and eventually the source of his greatest troubles. But at this stage in his life, it manifested mainly in vigorous conversation. And how he relished conversation. In taverns, drawing rooms, and courthouse steps, John sparred verbally with local politicians, merchants, and thinkers. He was never theatrical. Flamboyance was not in his nature. But his arguments carried a kind of steely elegance. When someone claimed that the young country needed stronger federal institutions, John countered with historical examples of empires that collapsed under the weight of centralized rule. When a merchant argued that Washington ought to regulate more aggressively to spur economic growth, John reminded him of the dangers of distant policymakers dictating local realities. Still, his criticisms were never blind. He recognized that unity was essential for national survival. But unity, he insisted, must grow from genuine agreement, not from decree. The Constitution was his compass, and he read it as a document built on restraint of power, restraint of ambition, restraint of government itself. His reputation grew, and with it, expectations. Neighbors, friends, and community leaders began urging him to enter politics. It wasn't rare for Virginia lawyers of standing to pursue public office, but John hesitated. He was introspective, cautious, almost allergic to personal ambition. But something had already begun pulling him toward the political stage. The feeling that if he did not speak, someone else might speak poorly in his place. Opportunity arrived sooner than expected. In 1811, when he was only 21, a vacancy opened in the Virginia House of Delegates. Despite his youth, influential local figures rallied behind him, convinced that his command of legal reasoning and his dedication to state sovereignty made him a compelling candidate. John initially resisted. Politics felt unpredictable, almost chaotic. Too much emotion, too many egos. But after conversations with his father and a few sleepless nights, he agreed. The nation was changing rapidly. Conflicts with Britain were intensifying, sectional disagreements widening, and the experiment of American democracy was still trembling like a newborn horse unsure of its footing. Silence, he realized, could be a kind of irresponsibility. So he ran, and he won. His arrival in the House of Delegates was akin to a young actor stepping onto the stage of a play already mid-scene. Debates crackled with tension. Older statesmen, men who had served alongside Jefferson and Madison, loomed large. John felt the weight of the chambers, with their heavy drapes and worn wooden desks, as if stepping into living history. But once he began to speak, something settled inside him. He could feel the ideas he had nurtured since childhood forming into precise arguments. He defended states' rights with crisp clarity. He opposed measures he believed would erode local autonomy. He championed limited government, not as an abstract principle, but as a necessary safeguard for the fragile young republic. And always, always, he grounded his positions in the Constitution. Beyond the chamber walls, the United States edged toward conflict. Tensions with Britain simmered, then boiled. The War of 1812 loomed like a storm cloud, and debates over how to respond split the country. John had reservations about the war, not because he sympathized with Britain, but because he feared the consequences of hasty federal decisions. Yet when Virginia called for defense, he supported the mobilization. Unlike some politicians, he understood that principle and practicality must sometimes share a difficult handshake. During these turbulent years, John's confidence grew. He discovered that public life suited him more deeply than he expected. Politics, he realized, wasn't only about speeches or votes. It was a battlefield of ideas, and he found himself uniquely suited to fight there. He still returned often to the plantation, seeking refuge in the quiet rhythms of home. The fields, the wind brushing through the tall grass, the creak of the old porch boards, these grounded him. They reminded him of the ordinary people whose lives were shaped, sometimes invisibly, by decisions made in distant halls of government. He felt responsibility toward them, even the ones he never met. That sense of responsibility, fused with an increasingly crystallized political philosophy, set him on a course that would carry him far beyond the House of Delegates. A seat in Congress awaited him. Battles over national policy, constitutional interpretation, and the limits of presidential power lay ahead. And fate, always mischievous, had already begun weaving the threads that would one day place him in the highest office in the land. But for now, he was still young, still learning, still discovering his voice in a nation struggling to define its own. The road was long, full of twists he could never predict. Yet as he left the chamber each evening, the sun dipping behind the rooftops of Richmond, he felt a growing certainty in his chest. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Chapter 3: The Rising Congressman in a Nation at War. When John Tyler entered the United States House of Representatives in 1816, he stepped across a threshold far larger than the wooden doorway of the Capitol. He walked into a nation shaken, proud, wounded, and oddly energized by the recently concluded War of 1812. The war had burned cities, rattled nerves, and exposed the country's growing pains. Yet it also filled Americans with a strange new confidence. They had survived a clash with the greatest empire on earth. They had not broken. And in the embers of that conflict, a nascent national identity flickered, uneven but unmistakable. For Tyler, arrival in Congress was not so much a triumph as an obligation. The House chamber hummed with the voices of seasoned politicians, men whose careers were woven into the very fabric of the Revolution and the early Republic. The walls seemed to vibrate with history, as if the echoes of founding debates still lingered between the columns. John, barely in his mid-20s, felt the immensity of the place settle on his shoulders like a mantle he had no choice but to wear. He quickly noticed something troubling. Though the war had ended, factional wounds had not healed. Fierce disagreements flared over tariffs, internal improvements, federal spending, and the scope of congressional power. The nation, only 4 decades old, was already arguing about what kind of country it wanted to become. John watched these quarrels carefully, analyzing the fault lines. One of the most divisive issues was the proposal for a protective tariff, a tax on imported goods designed to bolster American manufacturing. Northern states loved the idea. Southern states despised it. To Southerners like Tyler, the tariff smelled of federal intrusion. It favored one region's economy at the expense of another. He believed the government should not tilt the playing field. In one of his early speeches, he stood with a calmness that belied his age. His voice carried across the chamber, clear, steady, but firm. The Constitution, he argued, does not grant Congress the authority to nurture one branch of industry at the expense of another. He spoke without flourish, no theatrical gestures, but the room listened. Some were impressed by his legal precision. Others bristled at what they saw as youthful audacity. Yet the speech marked Tyler's arrival as something more than a freshman congressman. It signaled the emergence of a mind unafraid to tread into the thorniest constitutional debates. John's distrust of federal power also shaped his views on internal improvements, roads, canals, and infrastructure projects that many believed were essential for growth. To him, the question was not whether roads were useful, but whether the Constitution permitted Congress to fund them. He believed that states should manage their own development and that centralized authority, however well-intentioned, carried the seeds of future tyranny. Such views earned him a reputation, principled to some, obstinate to others. Still, the young representative was not driven purely by ideology. He had a human side that colleagues gradually discovered. In private, he was witty, soft-spoken, thoughtful. He played the violin with surprising tenderness. He wrote long letters home describing the rhythms of Congress, the personalities of fellow legislators, and the smell of damp winter mornings in Washington. He missed the quiet of Virginia. He missed the open fields. But he also felt a growing attachment to the life of lawmaking, a sense that his voice, however modest, mattered in shaping the country. Outside the chamber, the world continued to shift. Westward expansion accelerated. New states were forming, each bringing new political tensions. The Missouri crisis loomed, casting a long shadow over debates about slavery and balance of power. Tyler watched these developments with increasing worry. The country was stretching, not only geographically, but philosophically. He feared it might tear. Through all this, his personal life remained a source of stability. Letters from home often included updates from his father or affectionate notes from close friends. And in the midst of his congressional duties, something unexpected happened. He fell in love. Letitia Christian, a woman of grace, intelligence, and quiet strength, captured his heart with the kind of certainty that left him both astonished and grateful. Where John was cerebral, Letitia was warm. Where he was principled to the point of stubbornness, she offered gentle balance. Their courtship unfolded through letters and carefully arranged visits. She understood his ambitions without being dazzled by them. She grounded him in ways he had not realized he needed. Their marriage in 1813, before his arrival in Congress, remained the anchor of his early career. Letitia provided a calmness that followed him like a breeze through the heaviest political storms. During congressional recesses, John returned home, slipping back into the rhythms of plantation life. He walked the fields at sunset, inspecting crops and listening to the cicadas. He visited old friends and discussed politics over simple meals. These periods of return gave him clarity. Each time he went back to Washington, he carried with him not just opinions, but the memory of the people whose lives were shaped by distant policies. Yet in Washington, the political climate continued to harden. In 1819, the financial panic swept across the nation, causing bank failures, unemployment, and widespread suffering. Angry citizens demanded federal action. Tyler, however, remained consistent in his philosophy. He did not want a national bank dictating monetary policy from afar. He feared financial power concentrated in the hands of a few. His speeches became sharper, his arguments more forceful. Some colleagues whispered that Tyler was too rigid, that he would never compromise enough to rise in politics. But others admired his unwavering consistency. In an era of shifting alliances and opportunistic maneuvering, Tyler's clarity was refreshing, even if frustrating. But clarity does not guarantee political longevity. After several terms in Congress, John chose not to seek re-election. The decision surprised many, though not those closest to him. His father had fallen ill, his children were growing, his law practice needed attention, and truthfully, he longed for a respite from the grinding battles of Washington. Returning home felt like stepping into a cool stream after a long march under the sun. But stepping back did not mean stepping away. Virginia, ever fertile ground for political engagement, soon called him into service again. First the state legislature, then the governorship, and eventually the Senate would become stages for his evolving political identity. The battles ahead would test him far more severely than anything he faced in the House. And somewhere in the background, an unexpected future was slowly forming. A presidency no one predicted, a crisis no one wanted, a legacy no one agreed on. But for now, the young congressman was still learning how to navigate the treacherous tides of American politics, still sharpening the beliefs that would define him, still discovering that the nation he loved was as fragile as it was ambitious. History, patient as ever, was watching him. Not loudly, not yet, but with growing interest. Chapter 4. The Accidental President. When John Tyler went to bed on the night of April 4, 1841, he was simply the Vice President of the United States, a position he had accepted with a mixture of duty, curiosity, and a hint of political mischief. He had not expected much to come of it. The vice presidency at that time was little more than an afterthought, a ceremonial perch that offered prestige but little real power. Tyler himself often joked that the job required more patience than purpose. He served as president of the Senate, cast an occasional tie-breaking vote, and otherwise lingered in a kind of constitutional shadow. He still lived mostly in Virginia, far from the noise of Washington, and had no reason to believe the arrangement would change anytime soon. But history enjoys playing with expectations. Often it ambushes its characters in quiet moments, during breakfast, during sleep, or, as in Tyler's case, while sipping tea in his family parlor in Williamsburg. A horseman galloped through the afternoon haze, pounding toward the Tyler estate at breakneck speed. Dust trailed behind him like a ribbon. Servants paused their chores to watch him come, uneasy with the urgency of his arrival. The rider swung off the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He handed Tyler a sealed letter bearing the unmistakable ink and crest of Washington City. Tyler opened it slowly, as if sensing the heaviness of its contents. President William Henry Harrison was dead. Tyler blinked, reread the line, then lowered the letter onto the table. His children stared at him, waiting for his usual calm explanation, but the words did not come. Something vast and irreversible had just shifted, not only in his life, but in the very machinery of the Republic. The United States had never lost a president in office. No one knew exactly what should happen next. The Constitution, wise though it was, offered only an ambiguous sentence, that in case of the president's death, the powers and duties of the office would devolve upon the vice president. But did that mean the vice president became president, or merely acted as one temporarily?
He rose from his chair, not in triumph, but in stunned contemplation. He was only 51, still energetic, still sharp, but not prepared for this kind of ascent. He ordered a carriage to take him to Washington immediately. The road north was bumpy, long, and damp with early spring rain. As the miles rolled under the wheels, Tyler sat silently with his thoughts, almost as if he were traveling not toward a city, but toward a cliff edge. When he arrived at the Capitol, he found confusion swirling like smoke above every conversation. Cabinet members whispered among themselves. Newspapers raced to print extra editions. Senators speculated wildly. Some thought Tyler would simply oversee the government until a new election. Others believed he should inherit everything, title, authority, and all. Tyler made his decision quietly but firmly. He would be the President of the United States, not acting, not temporary, not caretaker. The moment Harrison drew his last breath, the Constitution had passed the presidency to the vice president, and Tyler intended to honor that interpretation fully. It was a bold stance, and it would change American history. The next morning, he summoned a judge to the Hotel Brown's dining parlor, where Tyler was temporarily staying. The room smelled faintly of coffee and pipe smoke. Cabinet secretaries pressed against the wall, watching solemnly as the judge raised his hand and administered the presidential oath of office. Tyler repeated it with perfect clarity. By the time he finished the last words, he had crossed an invisible threshold. He was now the 10th president. Nothing about his voice or posture changed dramatically, yet the room felt different. The men present sensed that they were witnessing the birth of a new constitutional tradition, the doctrine later called the Tyler precedent. But not everyone approved. Critics bristled. Some congressmen muttered that Tyler was an imposter. Whig leaders accused him of overreaching. A few jokingly called him his accidency, a nickname that would follow him like a stubborn shadow. The mockery irritated Tyler, but he bore it with a rigid, almost aristocratic pride. He believed deeply that he was defending not only his own dignity, but the continuity of the United States government. The cabinet put his claim to the test almost immediately. They approached him with a peculiar suggestion. They would continue running the administration by majority vote, just as they had under Harrison. Tyler listened, expression unreadable. Then he delivered what would become one of his most decisive lines. "Gentlemen, I am the president, and I prefer you to understand it plainly." The cabinet fell silent. Tyler thanked them for their service, but made it clear he alone held executive authority. The precedent was sealed. The United States had, for the first time, a fully recognized successor president. The public reaction was mixed. Some newspapers applauded his resolve, admiring his constitutional clarity. Others derided him as a man who grabbed at power. But ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, frontier families, seemed largely relieved. A stable nation, they reasoned, was better than a quarreling one, especially as America continued to expand westward like a restless creature searching for space. Tyler set up his new residence in the White House, a building still smelling faintly of smoke from when the British had burned it during the War of 1812. He walked its halls with a strange blend of humility and sureness, as though he were both a guest and the master of the house. At night, when the corridors quieted and the candlelit flickered softly along the paneled walls, Tyler often sat alone in the Red Room, considering the improbable chain of events that had placed him there. He had not campaigned for this role, he had not sought it, but now that it was his, he intended to shape it. In those still moments, a thought sometimes crossed his mind. History rarely asks permission before choosing its players. More often, it simply taps someone on the shoulder and whispers, "It is your turn." For John Tyler, that whisper had arrived on horseback, and the echo of it was only beginning. Chapter 5: The Loneliness of Power. The winter storms of 1842 rolled across Washington with the kind of brittle cold that made even marble seem to shiver. Inside the White House, President John Tyler moved through corridors that felt increasingly hollow, their silence echoing the silence of Congress. A man could stand in the center of that residence, its chandeliers glittering like frozen constellations, and feel utterly alone. Tyler in those months knew that sensation more intimately than he cared to admit. He had become a president without a party, a captain sailing a ship whose crew had simultaneously resigned, mutinied, or jumped overboard. The Whigs despised him for vetoing their cherished economic bills. The Democrats distrusted him for rejecting their embrace. The newspapers coined insult with the kind of vicious creativity. His accidency, the president without a people, the lone executive. Tyler read them all. He always claimed they didn't bother him, though on certain nights, when the lamps burned low and sleep were stubborn, their words pricked his mind like needles. Yet the man was not one to bow beneath political winter. Tyler had inherited a presidency unexpectedly, but he intended to wield its full constitutional weight. If party leaders wished to ostracize him, then he would prove that the presidency was not an arm of Congress or of Henry Clay's ambitions, but a separate, sovereign force. It was a philosophical stand as much as a political one, and philosophy had always been Tyler's compass. Still, ideals did not soften reality. The cabinet remained wary of him, some members avoiding open disagreement only out of decorum. When the entire Whig cabinet, except for Daniel Webster, resigned months earlier, it had left scars, subtle but deep. Tyler had rebuilt the cabinet with men who were willing to serve, yet every newspaper reminded the nation that these were not accepted appointments. The Senate simply refused to confirm several of them. For the first time in American history,
The president found himself blocked not for scandal, not for incompetence, but for daring to assert presidential authority. One evening in early February, Tyler sat near the East Room window, reading by lamplight. Outside, the leafless trees of the White House lawn scraped against each other like bony fingers. His son Robert entered the room. "Father," he said gently, "they're talking again about another vote to repeal the veto power, at least in matters of the National Bank." Tyler closed the book. "They can talk," he replied. "Talk costs nothing. Principles cost much." Robert hesitated. "Some of your friends think a compromise—" "Compromise," Tyler cut in, "is useful only when both sides seek the same destination. Clay seeks power. I seek the Constitution. Tell me, Robert, how does one compromise with that?" His son had no answer, and Tyler did not expect one. What kept the president moving during those months was not merely defiance, but a sense of mission. He believed the executive branch had drifted into subservience under Jackson and Van Buren. If he, Tyler, the man few expected to ever lead the nation, did not reassert its independence, who would? He often reminded his cabinet that history did not measure presidents by the applause of their contemporaries, but by the firmness of their conviction. Even so, loneliness touched everything. Banquets that once brimmed with senators and dignitaries were now sparsely attended affairs. Invitations returned empty. The White House social schedule grew thin. Some evenings, Tyler hosted small musicales in an effort to keep the residents warm with culture and company. His daughter Letitia played the harp, and visiting singers performed gentle ballads, though the applause felt faint, like a thin curtain trying to conceal the deeper tensions of the era. Outside the White House grounds, the nation had not stopped its restless turning. The economy fluctuated, Western settlers pushed toward the frontier, and the world beyond America's borders began to eye Texas. Tyler found solace in foreign policy, an arena where parties mattered less than national interest. The idea of annexing Texas stirred in him a mix of strategic calculation and Southern sentiment, but he knew that such ambition would require careful timing. Even one misstep would give his opponents another excuse to brand him reckless. On one raw March morning, Tyler walked alone along the Potomac's edge. The river moved with a heavy, deliberate current, as if dragging winter behind it. He listened to its rhythm, and in the quiet felt a truth he seldom voiced. Leadership could isolate a man, but isolation did not mean failure. Some presidencies were shaped by triumphs, others by survival. His, he suspected, would be shaped by endurance. As he watched the icy flow drift past, he recalled a saying his father had loved. "A tree is strongest where the wind most often strikes." Pressure, resistance, opposition, these were not burdens, but proof of resilience. Tyler straightened his shoulders. If the nation would not follow him willingly, then he would lead by example, by perseverance, by the stubborn insistence that the presidency must not bend to faction. By the time he returned to the White House, the lamps were being lit. Staff members nodded respectfully as he passed, though he sensed in their eyes the same uncertainty that pervaded the city. Tyler climbed the staircase slowly, thinking of the battles ahead. New vetoes, new cabinet disputes, new editorials filled with derision. Yet beneath it all lay something almost exhilarating. And standing alone, he was also standing free. And freedom, Tyler believed, was worth the storm. Chapter 6. The Texas Gambit. The spring of 1843 opened like a fan of new possibilities and new dangers before President John Tyler. While the cherry blossoms along the Potomac unfurled their pale petals, Washington whispered about one thing only: Texas. The word drifted through congressional corridors, salons, and taverns like smoke, curling into every conversation, carrying equal measures of hope and suspicion. For Tyler, it was no longer merely a distant republic, but an unfinished chapter of America's destiny. Yet his interest in Texas was not born of expansionist fever alone. He saw the annexation as a way to bind the nation more tightly, to strengthen American influence, and, though he rarely said it aloud, to define his fractured presidency with a decision bold enough to silence his critics. In those tense months, Texas became his proving ground. The diplomatic landscape was tricky. The Republic of Texas had won its independence from Mexico years earlier, but the victory remained fragile. Mexico still claimed the territory and had threatened war if the United States dared to take Texas under its wing. To complicate matters, Britain had begun flirting with the idea of influencing Texas, perhaps to curb the spread of American slavery, perhaps to hem in the upstart republic that the British press so often mocked. Tyler sensed the danger. A Texas drifting into Britain's embrace would reshape the continent's balance of power. Late one evening in April, Tyler met privately with Abel P. Upshur, his Secretary of State, a man of sharp intellect, soft voice, and unwavering loyalty. They sat in the cabinet room, candles throwing tall shadows onto the map of North America pinned across the wall. "You see the pattern," Upshur murmured, tracing the Gulf of Mexico with a fingertip. "If the British secure a foothold in Texas, they gain influence over cotton, over trade routes, over the very spine of Southern economics. It gives them a lever against us." "I know," Tyler nodded, "which means we must move first." "And decisively," Upshur added. "No hesitation, no half measures." Tyler leaned back, letting the chair creak under him. "Congress will fight us tooth and nail." "Then we outmaneuver Congress," Upshur replied calmly. "A treaty may be the cleanest path. Let them reject it if they dare. History will record who stood where." Tyler admired the clarity, rare in Washington. That night, he walked across the quiet White House grounds, the air smelling faintly of damp earth and blooming magnolia. His mind thrummed with purpose. He was a president surrounded by rivals, yet here, in the realm of foreign policy, he felt a sense of control he hadn't tasted in years. Work began in deliberate secrecy. Envoys were dispatched quietly. Letters were drafted in cipher. Tyler insisted on personally reviewing communications to Texas, wanting each phrase honed like the blade of a rapier. Diplomacy in that season felt like a duel fought with velvet gloves hiding steel. In June, a Texas diplomat named Isaac Van Zandt arrived in Washington. Formal protocol demanded restraint, but Tyler welcomed him with an eagerness that surprised even his own staff. During one long conversation in the Red Room, Tyler unfolded his vision for a united continent, Texas safely within the American family, protected from European meddling, firmly linked to the nation's prosperity. Van Zandt listened intently, his expression measured but hopeful. "Mr. President," he said quietly, "Texas desires security. Annexation offers that. But the political storms here, we hear they are fierce." Tyler smiled, tired but determined. "Fierce storms are navigable. betrayal of destiny is not. By late summer, negotiations sharpened. Upshur produced draft after draft of the annexation treaty. Tyler examined them with the care of a jeweler studying uncut stones. The challenge lay in balancing Texas's terms, American interests, and the volatile mood of Congress. Some senators were whispering again about impeachment, not for crimes, but simply because Tyler continued to govern without their blessing. Every political blow only strengthened his resolve. If they intend to break me, they will find I do not bend like green wood. As autumn painted the city in copper hues, foreign threats became more tangible. Rumors swirled of British emissaries courting Texas leaders with promises of loans and diplomatic recognition. Tyler reacted swiftly, ordering Upshur to accelerate negotiations. A sense of urgency shivered through the administration. But fate, in that era, refused to move in straight lines. On a cold February day in 1844, tragedy tore into Tyler's carefully woven plans. The USS Princeton, the Navy's proud new warship, hosted a ceremonial cruise along the Potomac. Tyler attended with several cabinet members and guests. Spirits were high, the vessel was a symbol of American strength, and the president hoped the event would bolster confidence in his leadership. Then came the explosion. A massive naval gun, the Peacemaker, burst catastrophically during a firing demonstration. Smoke, screams, splintered metal. The blast killed several high-ranking officials, including Abel P. Upshur. Tyler, standing on another part of the deck, survived. But as he ran toward the devastation, his coat flapping violently behind him, he felt the blow not merely as a near-death experience, but as the collapse of the one alliance he had depended on most. Upshur, the architect of the Texas Plan, the steady mind in chaotic days, was gone. Washington plunged into mourning. The newspapers, usually so eager to deride him, softened briefly. Even Congress paused its hostilities. But grief brought no pause to destiny. Tyler, hollow-eyed but resolute, appointed a new Secretary of State, John C. Calhoun, an experienced, brilliant, polarizing figure whose views on slavery and states' rights would inject new controversy into the Texas question. Yet Tyler did not retreat. If anything, he moved faster. By April 1844, the annexation treaty was completed. He had done it. Despite cabinet resignations, congressional hostility, and the stinging loneliness of leadership, Tyler steered the nation to the brink of a monumental shift. Whether the Senate would accept the treaty, that was another battle entirely. But battles never frightened him. Battles defined him. Chapter 7. A nation divided, a president cornered. The ink on the Texas Annexation Treaty had barely dried when Washington erupted like a cannon burst, echoing across the Potomac. In the Capitol, senators pored over the document with expressions ranging from intrigue to open disgust. In the city's taverns, men slammed tankards onto tables, debating whether President John Tyler had saved the nation from British manipulation or dragged it toward war with Mexico. For once, every voice, friend, foe, and foreign diplomat was tuned to the same question. Would the Senate ratify the treaty. Tyler knew the answer would not come easily. The Senate was dominated by Whigs, the very party that had expelled him like an unwanted limb. Many of those senators viewed Tyler not as a president, but as a trespasser, sitting in a chair meant for someone else. And now, that trespasser had dared to issue them a challenge, wrapped in the parchment of international diplomacy. Inside the White House, Tyler studied the early reports. His face remained unreadable, but his fingers tapped slightly against the mahogany desk. "They will not give me victory freely," he murmured. "No," replied John C. Calhoun, seated opposite him. Calhoun had replaced Abel Upshur as Secretary of State after the Princeton disaster. If Upshur had been a quiet strategist, Calhoun was a thunderbolt, brilliant, defiant, endlessly controversial. His arguments for annexation were tied closely to the protection of slavery in the South, which invited both support and political fire. Tyler, though wary of Calhoun's polarizing nature, understood that the man wielded influence like a duelist wields a blade. Outside their conversations, however, the country was fracturing. In the North, newspapers warned darkly that Tyler's treaty would inflame sectional tensions and strengthen the so-called slave power. In the South, planters murmured that annexation was not merely desirable, but necessary for maintaining political parity. Meanwhile, Mexico protested loudly, threatening war if Texas were absorbed into the Union. It was a storm in every direction. Tyler faced it with the strange calm of a man who had already been pushed past the point of caring what others thought. Legacy, not popularity, was his compass now. As spring warmed into the soft green of early summer, the Senate commenced formal debate. The chamber became a theater of fierce oratory. Henry Clay, the lion of the Whigs, spoke against the treaty with a mixture of principle and political calculation. He feared annexation would upend the delicate balance of free and slave states. He also feared, though he would never say it aloud, that if Tyler succeeded, it might reshape the presidential race in ways he could not control. Clay stood beneath the great chandelier of the Senate chamber, his voice rising like a storm wind. "This treaty," he declared, "is an invitation to conflict abroad and discord at home." The words thundered through the hall and spilled into the newspapers the next morning. Northerners cheered, Southerners bristled. The Senate walls seemed to pulse with heat, as if the debates themselves were kindling a slow burning fire. Tyler listened to accounts with stoic attention. He paced the length of the White House corridors in the late evenings, his candle flickering against the ornate wallpaper. At times, he paused before the windows, watching the gas lamps glow faintly along Pennsylvania Avenue. Washington was small then, still half swamp, half ambition, but Tyler felt the weight of futures yet unwritten pressing against the quiet. He knew the Senate had the votes to kill the treaty. Still, he waited. Sometimes defiance itself becomes a strategy. On June 8, 1844, the verdict arrived. The Senate rejected the annexation treaty by a crushing margin. Calhoun read the tally with a bitter twist of the lips. "They have chosen short sight over destiny," he said sharply. Tyler's reaction was quieter. He closed the folder containing the treaty and rested his hands atop it. "Then," he said softly, "we will find another way." Those 7 words marked a shift, not only in strategy, but in the very architecture of American politics. For while the Senate had spoken, the nation had not. Tyler now turned to the people. He ordered the treaty to be published in full, letting citizens judge the arguments the Senate had suffocated behind closed doors. Newspapers burst with commentary. Rural towns debated the question in dusty meeting halls. The idea of Texas, its open prairies, its young independence, its oilless but dream-heavy soil, caught fire in the public imagination. To many Americans, Texas symbolized possibility. But Tyler's greatest opportunity came from the presidential campaign of 1844. Martin Van Buren and Henry Clay, both political giants, opposed annexation. Their caution infuriated expansionist Democrats. And so, in a dramatic twist, the Democratic Party nominated not Van Buren, but James K. Polk, a relatively unknown politician who championed the reannexation of Texas with almost missionary zeal. Tyler saw the opening and lunged. In August, he officially withdrew from the election. He knew he could not win, but he released his delegates to Polk, ensuring that the pro-annexation vote would consolidate behind one candidate. If Polk won, annexation would gain a second life. It was a staggeringly clever move. Critics mocked Tyler for quitting the race. Supporters recognized the maneuver for what it was, the move of a chess player, sacrificing his own peace to secure the board. November arrived in a flurry of cold winds and political tension. Polk won. The message was unmistakable. The American people supported annexation. Suddenly, senators who had scoffed at Tyler's treaty felt the ground shifting beneath them. The president they had condemned as illegitimate now held the moral high ground. And in his final weeks in office, weeks in which a lesser man might have faded quietly, Tyler prepared his final offensive. He called for annexation not by treaty, but by joint resolution, a mechanism requiring only a simple majority in both the House and Senate. It was audacious. It was controversial. It was entirely constitutional. And it bypassed the very blockade that had crushed him before. As winter deepened, Tyler worked tirelessly. He courted congressmen. He negotiated, compromised, reasoned, appealed to patriotism, invoked destiny. His opponents were stunned to find that the man they had dismissed as weak wielded persistence like a weapon. By February 1845, only weeks before Tyler would leave the White House, the resolution reached Congress for a vote. The tension was suffocating. Inside the gallery, spectators leaned forward. Senators sat still as statues. Tyler waited in the White House, his heart steady, but his thoughts racing through every twist of the last 2 years. The votes were counted. The joint resolution passed. Texas would join the United States. Tyler exhaled a breath 2 years long. Outside, the winter wind rapped against the window panes as if applauding. Newspapers would soon roar with headlines. Foreign governments would scramble to respond. Mexico would rage. But nothing could erase the fact that a president without a party had changed the map of a continent. Tyler stood, walked to the Oval Office window, and looked out across the darkened city. For the first time in a long while, he felt peace. Chapter 8. The Last Winter in the White House. The winter of 1844 settled over Washington with a bleakness that mirrored the atmosphere inside the White House. Frost clung to the iron railings. The Potomac stiffened into slow-moving slabs of ice, and the bare branches of the elms trembled like old soldiers in the wind. For President John Tyler, these final months of his term felt like walking through a season suspended between worlds. One foot still in the presidency, the other already drifting toward an uncertain future beyond the Capitol. Yet Washington was far from quiet. The victory of James K. Polk in the presidential election had changed the tone of the city. Suddenly, annexation, once a controversial dream, became a national mandate. Tyler sensed the shifting currents and knew his moment had not ended with the Senate's earlier rejection. The nation was still listening, and the wheels of destiny were turning faster than anyone expected. Inside the cabinet room, a fire burned low as Tyler met with his remaining advisors. Several chairs sat empty. Over the years, resignations, political rifts, and the turbulence of his presidency had hollowed out the cabinet like a tree weathered by too many storms. Only the most loyal, or the most stubborn, remained. Mr. President, Secretary of State John C. Calhoun began, adjusting his spectacles. The joint resolution is gaining traction. If we can secure a few more votes in the House, the Senate will have no choice but to confront the will of the people. Tyler nodded, hands clasped behind his back as he paced slowly. The nation has already spoken. Now Congress must decide whether it will heed that voice or hide from it. But beneath his controlled tone lay something deeper, determination mixed with exhaustion, the two intertwined like the black and white threads of a rope stretched taut. He knew that every step from here on would define how history remembered him. For 4 years, he had been mocked as his accidency, shunned by his own party, and dismissed as a political orphan. Now, as the end approached, he felt the urgency to carve his legacy into the stone of the Republic before the door closed behind him forever. Outside the White House, protests flared and newspapers fired volleys of accusation. The annexation of Texas had become a lightning rod for every fear and ambition the country possessed. Abolitionists warned that expanding the South's influence would plunge the nation deeper into the moral quagmire of slavery. Businessmen fretted about war with Mexico. Enthusiasts of manifest destiny hailed Tyler as a champion of American expansion. The country was not merely divided, it was cracking along lines that would later erupt into far greater conflict. Yet Tyler did not retreat from the storm. He plunged into it with a force that startled even those who knew him well. In December, he sent a special message to Congress urging the annexation of Texas. His words were bold, almost defiant. "Should we shrink from our responsibilities as a nation," he wrote, "the opportunity may never come again." His message echoed throughout the Capitol, sparking debates that stretched into the early hours of cold winter mornings. As members of Congress marched back and forth between chambers, Tyler worked the corridors of influence quietly, relentlessly, with the instinctive grace of a man who had survived decades of political battlegrounds. He met with representatives one by one, engaging them not with threats or bribes, but with conviction and an almost philosophical clarity about the nation's destiny. Some relented, some remained unmoved, but the tide unmistakably turned. Meanwhile, the White House began to change in subtle ways. Preparations were underway for the incoming administration. Polk's staff visited frequently, their faces polite but distant. Tyler watched them move through the halls like surveyors mapping land they would soon possess. He felt a strange mix of relief and wistfulness. The presidency had been both a burden and a calling. Now it was slipping from his grasp like a chapter ending in a book he had not fully finished. One January evening, as snow fell thick over Washington, Tyler slipped away from a meeting and walked out onto the South Lawn. The world was quiet, muffled by the snowfall. The White House loomed behind him, a pale giant against the night. He inhaled the cold air deeply, letting it sting his lungs. He thought of Virginia, of his family waiting for him at Sherwood Forest, of the simpler life he had once imagined, and he wondered, not without a trace of melancholy, whether his presidency had cost him more than it had given. Later that same night, his daughter Letitia joined him by the fireplace. She had become one of his confidants since the death of her mother 2 years earlier. Her voice carried the softness of someone who understood her father's burdens intimately. "Will they pass it, Father?" she asked. Tyler stared into the flames. He said, "They will," he said quietly. This country moves forward whether its leaders step willingly or are dragged kicking. Annexation is its path. But at what cost? That, Tyler said, is for history to decide. January turned to February, and the political temperature in Washington rose despite the bitter cold. Whig leaders fumed, accusing Tyler of overreach. Democrats maneuvered with newfound boldness. Foreign emissaries watched with careful eyes. Mexico issued threats. Britain prodded diplomacy from the shadows. It was as though the entire world held its breath. Then at last, the day arrived. On February 27th, 1845, the House of Representatives approved the joint resolution. The Senate followed on March 1st, passing it by a razor-thin margin. The chamber erupted, some in applause, others in fury. Outside, news spread across the city like wildfire. In the White House, Tyler received the message with a stillness that belied the storm behind his eyes. "It is done," he whispered. He signed the resolution on March 1st, just 3 days before leaving office. When the pen lifted from the page, Tyler, once dismissed as a political accident, had changed the geography of North America. That night, he walked once more through the quiet corridors of the White House. Portraits of past presidents gazed down at him. Washington, sternly dignified, Jefferson, sharp-eyed, Madison, contemplative. He paused before each one, his steps echoing softly in the half-lit hall. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply allowed himself a moment of long, steady breath. He had been tested, scorned, isolated, underestimated. Yet, he had endured. And as he prepared to step away from power, the winter outside no longer felt so heavy. The storm had passed, not quietly, not peacefully, but with purpose. Ahead lay the final chapter of his presidency and the uncertain horizon of life beyond the White House. Chapter 9: The Quiet Tempest. The 9th year of John Tyler's tangled public life never unfolded with the clarity of a well-drawn map. It behaved more like a river in late spring, muddy, changeable, carrying broken branches and glittering reflections in the same restless sweep. Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, understood this instability more than most. His presidency had begun in accident. Now, with the country's political machinery grinding and smoking like an overworked forge, he found himself once again trying to steer a wagon hitched to unruly horses. The chapter of his life opened with the Capitol glowing under a winter dawn. Snow lay like sifted flour across the city's unfinished streets. Tyler stood at his window, hands clasped behind his back, looking toward the building where Congress was, at that very moment, preparing to debate yet another measure he opposed. The man had grown accustomed to being treated as a guest in his own political house. The Whigs had expelled him. The Democrats distrusted him. His cabinet had fractured long ago. Politics had become, for Tyler, a study in controlled solitude. Yet solitude can be a forge. It sharpens thinking, hardens will, and sometimes reveals a hidden hinge in history. Tyler sensed such a hinge turning beneath his feet. The annexation of Texas, once a distant theoretical matter, was now close enough that one could almost smell the dust of the frontier drifting into Washington's corridors. For many, Texas represented destiny. For others, it represented the widening crack in a nation already arguing itself hoarse over slavery. And Tyler, navigating between these realities, saw a chance to secure a legacy that wasn't simply footnoted as the man who succeeded Harrison. He spent his mornings reading letters from the frontier, reports from envoys, quiet warnings from northern congressmen, exuberant pleas from southern planters. The stack of correspondence on Texas alone grew into a leaning tower on his desk. Each letter carried its own logic, its own fear, its own dream. And like any president caught between competing visions of the nation, Tyler learned to read between the lines, where the truth usually hides. There was one letter he reread more than any other. It came from an elderly Virginian, a man Tyler had known casually in his youth. The handwriting was crooked, the ink uneven, but the sentiment was sharp. A president must choose the long road, even when it is the loneliest. History does not reward comfort. Tyler kept that line close, tucking it into the inner pocket of his coat. He liked how it felt, a small paper compass when the political landscape swirled like fog. The spring session of Congress brought storms of its own. The debate over the annexation treaty grew so heated that newspapers in New York described it as legislative thunder. Senators paced, shouted, gestured with the abandon of men convinced that the republic's soul was being weighed in real time. Tyler appeared calm in public, but inside, he felt the pressure of a man holding the final plank of a collapsing bridge. He knew that pressing the treaty too aggressively could explode the fragile equilibrium of the Union. He also knew that doing nothing would leave Texas vulnerable and the nation's Western ambitions stalled. His closest advisors, a patchwork team assembled from political strays and loyalists who had refused to abandon him, urged a careful but relentless push. They met late into the night in lamplight that flickered like nervous heartbeats. Tyler listened, nodded, paced, sat again. Politics is rarely about certainty. It is about tolerable risk. And Tyler was learning that the line between caution and paralysis grows thin under pressure. Beyond the halls of government, a different kind of storm gathered. Newspapers printed savage caricatures of him, sometimes depicting him as a wooden puppet or a solitary tree being battered by winds from all sides. Editors gave him nicknames, some witty, some cruel, all memorable. Tyler read them with the grim amusement of a man who had long accepted that public opinion rarely behaves like a polite dinner guest. Yet, these attacks had a curious effect. They grounded him. When the world insists on misreading you, you start defining yourself with unusual clarity. He sought refuge in music during these months. His new wife, Julia, brought warmth to the White House in ways that public affairs could not. Many evenings, Tyler sat with her in the East Room as musicians played. The sound of violins softened the sharp edges of politics. Music is a time machine of sorts. It pulls a person backward into memory and forward into possibility. Tyler often closed his eyes and imagined a future America stretching from ocean to ocean, a land both unpredictable and wondrous. Summer heat soon pressed against the city, thick as wool. Congress adjourned without giving him the victory he wanted. The treaty failed in the Senate. That defeat stung more sharply than Tyler expected, a sting that settled in his teeth. But the man was not built to surrender. If one path closed, he would carve another. But stubborn creativity, a trait history sometimes forgets to acknowledge, he shifted strategy. Instead of pursuing annexation through a treaty requiring 2/3 approval, he pushed for a simple joint resolution requiring only a majority. It was a risky maneuver, legally questionable, politically explosive. But sometimes the hinge of history swings only if someone dares to lean on it. Tyler leaned with all his weight. By autumn, the nation's mood had changed. Expansionist fever spread across cities and small towns like wildfire carried by rumor. Campaign speeches crackled with bravado. Newspapers heralded visions of a continental republic. When the joint resolution finally passed, Tyler felt a surge of vindication. Not triumph, not gloating, simply the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who sees a difficult task reach completion. As he signed the resolution, His hand paused for a moment. A thought passed through him, subtle as a breeze through a cracked window. History rarely remembers the noise of the debate, but it always remembers the outcome. This year of his presidency closed like a door gently pushed by the wind. Tyler walked the White House grounds on the first cold evening of winter, his breath forming pale clouds. The grass glittered with frost. He knew his time in office was ending, but something deeper settled inside him, a sense of having shaped the nation's spine, however controversially. The quiet tempest of his ninth chapter had passed. The next chapter would demand its own courage, its own strange improvisations. History, after all, is never content with straight lines. Chapter 10. A Legacy Measured in Echoes. The final movement of John Tyler's presidency began with a kind of stillness that belied the storms he had navigated. It was the quiet that hangs over a battlefield at dawn, unsettling not because nothing is happening, but because so much has already happened. Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, could sense that his political hourglass was nearly empty, grains of time slipping through with an almost audible hiss. Yet, in that narrowing window, he felt a strange surge of purpose, as if the closing chapters of his tenure demanded a clarity he had been chasing for years. Washington, in the early months of 1845, was a city poised on the edge of transformation. Streets churned with carriages, gossip, and the faint smell of coal smoke. The Capitol dome, still incomplete, looked less like a symbol of permanence and more like a promise still being negotiated. Tyler often gazed at it during his carriage rides, pondering how incomplete structures mirrored incomplete legacies. A presidency is never finished cleanly. It leaves loose threads, contradictions, echoes. Those echoes weighed on him during his last weeks. Politicians, journalists, cabinet members, even casual acquaintances approached him with a kind of calculated politeness. There is a particular manner in which people treat a president whose term is fading. They become suddenly generous with praise, yet careful with commitment. Tyler noticed this theatrical kindness, recognized it as a ritual of transition, and accepted it with a weary half-smile. He had never been Washington's favorite son. He did not expect its affection now. But he had won something more durable than favor. He had secured the annexation of Texas, a seismic act that would shape the continent long after temporary alliances dissolved. That achievement did not silence his critics. Nothing ever truly does. But it gave Tyler a sense of completion. He had pushed against political gravity and, through a mix of grit and ingenuity, bent history's direction. Still, the final days were not a parade of triumph. They were filled with the practical debris of departure, sorting documents, drafting final messages, deciding what to pack and what to leave behind. Tyler walked through the White House with the reflective gaze of someone examining a house he had lived in but never fully belonged to. He paused often at the entrance hall where he first stepped as an unexpected president, at the state dining room where political bargains had been whispered between bites, at the East Room where music had softened his burdens. Julia, youthful and radiant, approached the transition with a brisk determination. She had infused the mansion with liveliness during his tenure. Laughter, music, candle-lit receptions, and now she oversaw the packing with the precision of a general preparing a campaign. Tyler admired her energy. It balanced his contemplative mood. Together they formed a curious portrait, a man at the end of one journey and a woman at the beginning of another. Outside the mansion, the nation debated what Tyler represented. Newspapers wondered aloud whether he had been a visionary or a political accident made inconveniently consequential. In taverns, some argued he had saved the West. Others insisted he had hastened the fracturing of the Union. Tyler understood that history would judge him with slow deliberation, long after the heat of the moment cooled. He took comfort in that thought. Snap judgments are the noise of the present. History speaks in echoes. A week before leaving office, he received a quiet, unexpected visit. Henry Clay, the great statesman who had once sculpted the Whig Party, arrived at the White House unannounced. Their relationship had been an opera of rivalry, admiration, resentment, and ideological collision. Clay was a man of grand designs and persuasive thunder. Tyler was a man of constitutional restraint and quiet stubbornness. They had clashed like river currents meeting at the falls. Clay entered the room with his cane clicking softly against the floor. His expression was no longer fiery, but thoughtful, marked by the softened edges of age and perspective. Tyler rose to greet him, unsure whether this would be a confrontation or a farewell. To his surprise, Clay offered neither blame nor praise. Instead, he spoke of the country, its beauty, its fragility, its boundless contradictions. Politics had aged both men. The Republic had become a canvas painted by their struggles. Clay acknowledged their disagreements, but saluted Tyler's resolve in pursuing what he believed the nation required. It was not reconciliation exactly, but something rarer, recognition. After Clay departed, Tyler sat for a long time without moving. Encounters like that do not alter history, but they do settle the mind. He felt a small weight lift from him, like a stone finally dislodged from a boot. His last days in office rushed forward. Polk's inauguration approached with the momentum of a rolling train, and Tyler found himself swept into the rituals of transition. He prepared his final address to Congress, a message crafted with the calm tone of a man leaving his handwriting in the margins of history. He emphasized unity, expansion, constitutional fidelity. He avoided self-congratulation. Legacy is most authentic when stated by others. The morning of March 4th arrived cold and sharp. Crowds filled the streets, muffled in scarves and anticipation. Tyler rode to the Capitol, not as the unexpected president he once was, but as a man who had carved his own path through doubt and contradiction. He sat quietly as Polk took the oath, listening to the words drift into the winter air. That moment was not painful for him. It felt like the closing of a chapter that had been both demanding and strangely luminous. The weight lifted from his shoulders in a way he had not anticipated. He realized he could breathe deeply again, no longer braced against the shifting tempests of Washington. After the ceremony, Tyler and Julia departed the city. Their carriage rattled over the rough winter roads as Washington faded behind them. Ahead lay Sherwood Forest, the plantation where he planned to write, reflect, and rebuild a quieter life. The trees lining the road swayed like silent witnesses to the turning of eras. Tyler looked out the window with the thoughtful expression, not of regret, but of contemplation. A presidency is never truly finished. It follows a person like a long shadow. But he felt ready to step into the next landscape, one where public duty gave way to private purpose. His legacy would take decades to untangle. Scholars would debate him. Critics would scold him. Admirers would defend him. Yet, the echoes of his choices, Texas, constitutional precedent, stubborn individuality would ripple across the continent. In that carriage rolling toward the horizon, Tyler sensed those echoes gathering behind him like a tide. The chapter of his presidency had closed, but its resonance had only begun. History would not forget him. It rarely forgets those who change its direction, however controversially. And the continent he helped shape was just beginning its long, tumultuous transformation, a story that would continue far beyond the road unfolding before him.
If you liked this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more great stories.